So my name is Tommy Hutchinson. I'm founder of iGenius. I'm also co-founder of the Global Center for Healthy Workplaces, and we have one other brand called Base Europe, which encourages trade and investment throughout the continent of Europe. I've worked in, indeed, I'm sometimes associate lecturer at Ravensbourne University, so it's particularly nice to speak today. And I've worked in the area of social innovation for about a couple of decades now, and I've worked in over 40 countries, 41 I think to be precise. And as you can imagine, as I'm sure all of you have, there are some extraordinary examples of great work being done out there. And I'll just choose one example of the many great things that I've seen. If you ever get an opportunity to go to Pakistan, there's a place called Zaki Farm in the Punjab, just outside kind of Lahore towards the border with India, where the founder there has created a wonderful farm where everything is, he creates his own energy, not only produces organic material and so on, but it's an entire ecosystem based in one farm. And he's also just about a few years ago created an educational center. There are many other other examples, and I'm sure you will all have your own favorite ones. But I come from a farm myself, originally in Ireland. That happens to be one of my favorites. And yet, as I, perhaps with coronavirus and so forth, as I reflect on the world of the landscape of social innovation, I feel strangely dissatisfied, strangely worried about the future. And I really wanted to use today's discussion to outline some of my concerns, but also what I think we need to do to re-energize the world of social innovation. And before I go further, let me just a quick pause for definitions. I'm talking about social innovation, social entrepreneurship, social business, social economy. I'm kind of mixing it all up. So I'll leave people more academic than myself to sort of segment which goes where. But I'm looking at the whole landscape of the wider social economy, of one part of which is social innovation. It is true that, over the couple of decades that I've worked in this area, we've made enormous advances. There are so many ideas around eco-friendly products and tackling many of the social issues that we experience throughout the world. In truth, we have won many battles, but I kind of fear that we're beginning to lose the overall war unless we do something quickly about it. For example, if you look at the speed at which the climate change is continuing to get worse. I have just today from the Financial Times, there is an article, maybe you can or cannot see that, which says that carbon emissions for 2021 are likely to be the second highest of all time. So we, despite all the debate, all the new technology, all the new areas that we're looking at in relation to climate change, the problem is not only getting worse, but if anything, probably the speed at which it's getting worse seems to be increasing. Biodiversity, whatever figures you want to pull out about how the environment, the loss of habitation, the loss of wildlife and so on, I'm sure you're very familiar with that. It is true that absolute poverty is coming down, but inequality between the rich and the poor may, certainly in some countries, may if anything be even increasing. Now, areas like racism and homophobia and misogyny, these are not discrimination against disabled people. These have been around a very long time, and we are making progress, but too often, and we're going to have to look on the streets of the United States to show that the progress is still, it should not be taking this long. And now we have a whole set of new threats around the digital world, cybercrime, and so forth, that we now have to consider. And over the last 4 years, we've seen, well, not for the first time, but certainly in the United States, we saw the rise of, white supremacy, Trumpism, Brexit, perhaps here in the UK, and a real sense that, some of those issues are going seriously wrong on the political arena. So in short, despite all the new talent, all the creativity, all the extra resources, we are at best making some progress in some areas, standing still in others, and going backwards in far too many. Question is, why so? And I want to illustrate 6 reasons why I think this picture is at best unsatisfactory. First is an insufficient focus by us as social innovators on the levers of power, on the levers of political power. There's been remarkably little advancement in how political power is exercised in a more social egalitarian way. And as we know, political power determines so much of the structures in which we operate in, and yet it's almost as if too many people in the social arena have kind of stayed clear of the political arena, and I think that is a great mistake. Of course, there are some exceptions. Maybe draw New Zealand as one area, one country where quite a lot of progress has perhaps been made in the political arena, but far too many countries, I think, social engagement in the political arena has not been suffice. Secondly, still insufficient economic resources being delivered to this area, and those resources that are being delivered are all too often inefficiently applied. I often say that Silicon Valley is probably the most inefficient allocation of resources you will find anywhere in the world. Lots of resources there, but very poorly applied. Whereas if you go to countries that doesn't have that kind of wealth, they're often much sharper at using their dollar to the maximum purpose. I certainly before coronavirus used to attend a regular breakfast session here in London, and about 150 social investors would attend on a regular occasion. And I used to sort of tot up what everyone was doing. And they were doing studies, they were doing consulting work, they were doing lots of things. But the actual number that were actually investing, releasing the funds, was minimal out of that particular gathering that existed. Too many people were ex-bankers, including myself. I used to be a banker, too often applying the old rules of finances rather than taking a fresh approach to the way finance is exercised. I won't name it in particular, but there's a new payment system is out for the last year or two. Very much innovative, very much creative, socially conscious, and so on. And actually, from California, and actually, if you look at it in any kind of detail, it is no different to a lot of the mainstream payment systems that are out there. So, too often, old rules are being rebranded with very, very little effect, especially in the area of finances. I think I think there's been insufficient democratic control and debate around the use of technology. Privacy is getting worse, the abuse of privacy. User rights, you sign up into anything digital, and it says click here for terms and conditions, you might as well be buying an expensive piece of machinery. It's far too complicated, deliberately made complicated by the producers, um, so that they can carry on accessing people's data, selling it on without people having properly understanding of what is happening to them. Spy technology is becoming a greater worry. And then we have new areas like cryptocurrencies. Fine, I'm still kind of working out what is the social improvement of that, but it comes at the cost of vast use of carbon resources, the vast burning of fossil fuels in order to drive the energy to actually make cryptocurrency work. Yet, we'll often portray that as a fine and innovative social innovation. Frankly, I really can't work out where the social innovation, where the social benefit applies. So, uh, and if you look in the world of technology, too often we do things and then we ask the questions later. Then we look and see what has that innovation actually caused good and too often for bad. It's exactly the same with the nuclear weapons, with nuclear energy. Yes, at time, an innovation, and then only later do people say, oh, what is the issue? Later today, I'm going to a funeral of a friend that's died of cancer. I don't know if he died as in some way related because of a pollution to do with nuclear energy. But it's entirely possible, and certainly cancer rates are phenomenally increased since the introduction of nuclear energy. But we too often innovate, and then we ask ourselves, what are the implications of that innovation? Number four, I think there's been generally very, and perhaps linked to number three, poor scenario planning. We don't do enough at looking at what are the future consequences. We don't look enough at what are the historical trends and the impact that our innovations will have on stakeholders, in some occasions to people directly or not directly connected with it. The debate, the debacle over the last couple of days about the European Football League shows that even the smartest people in the room perhaps haven't done a great deal of scenario planning and engagement with stakeholders. Fifth, there is a tendency to measure the wrong things or to avoid measuring those things that are important, such as happiness. Now, there have been some improvements in this area, but it is still very basic and it's still of great need of more innovation. And finally, my sixth point as to why I think part of I'm dissatisfied about the progress we've made is that too many of the people who are involved in social innovation come from rather exclusively involved from elitist backgrounds, still very higher education dominated, very class ridden. You only have to go to the Skoll Forum at Syed Business School at Oxford each April and I think you will perhaps know what I mean by that. So today, I want to set out 7 steps as to how I think we can put social innovation on a new footing. And the underlying theme is that I think we need to go beyond tinkering, beyond piecemeal change, and address it in a far greater magnitude. And the question is, how could we build the blocks that would would go beyond tinkering and would begin to address the scale of the problems that we face in the world today. And so first, I think that social innovators, social entrepreneurs, and so forth must recognize the importance of the political environment and must become politically engaged. and must, if possible, change the way politics is done. I have many social entrepreneur friends in Myanmar, and now they can't even access the internet because of the coup that has taken place there. Politics matters. It determines the rules in which societies are governed, both locally, nationally, and globally. And too often we stay clear of this, and I think that must change. Secondly, I think we must let the cash flow. Stop replicating the old failed ways in which the banking system works. Two areas in particular I would address on this. First of all, to cut out all of the pointless criterias that are attached to funding bids and to funding proposals. And again, from the Financial Times today, there's an article in the leaders column about how it has taken 3 years for sustainable finances, the rules to be applied for the progression of sustainable finances within the European Union. And it says the world has taken so long to develop adequate green financing and emissions reduction policies that it is running out of time. We haven't got time to mess around with criteria that are usually geared to excluding people from applying for funding opportunities, most of which aren't particularly relevant. Linked to this, I think that funders themselves must take more risks, must be more like a good organization in the UK called Venturesome that lends and gives money at a risk of 50%. So in other words, it's 50% prepared to lose its money, and then it works with the recipient to bring down the risk to a ratio of down to 25%, compared with the one that some years ago was receiving the most funding by the World Bank, poverty aid for Pakistan, which was operating on 100% risk portfolio. In other words, it was taking no risk at all. It was only giving money out to people who definitely would pay it back. And usually those very people can obtain finances from other sources in any case. So with the social investment, we must get real risk-taking inserted. Otherwise, we're not investing in real innovation in the slightly more risky, slightly more challenging areas. Third, I would like to see, and this is more particular in the area of social entrepreneurship and social businesses, the elimination of the pointless divide between for-profit organizations and not-for-profit organizations. And again, this is often used when it comes to funding criteria. You have to be a not-for-profit, a charity or so forth, in order to receive funding. The question is why? Surely the thing that matters most is what you're doing, the good that you're doing. That should be the criteria, not how you are governed, not your governance policies. And I could go in much longer on that matter, especially coming from an entrepreneurial background and a social entrepreneurial background, why this area is important. But because we have this ridiculous divide, it excludes so many important people who are doing good work, often who don't even have the legal structures in their country to run a not-for-profit, excluding them from much of the funding that is available. Fourth, I think we need to measure what is important. Now, there's some work has been done, and particularly, I would say, get engaged in the beyond GDP debate, beyond gross domestic product debate. There's I can't recall precisely the name of the person who won the Nobel Prize on this, and some good work is being done in this area, particularly by the OECD with their Better Life Index and so forth. But I think there's much more nuance can be applied in creating measurement models that are beyond GDP, that are beyond financial models, and so forth. Fifth, I think we need to reevaluate the way work itself. We need to create more time for flexible working, more time for people to work in other mainstream jobs, and giving them more time to apply also to work in the social arena. I think I've come down in favor of a basic income for everyone, at least in those countries where that is affordable. Um, and if and by creating more flexibility, by creating more equality in the way finances are allocated to employees, it will release an awful lot of energy, an awful lot of talent, an awful lot of time for people to apply themselves in social progressive purposes. Sixth, I've just got two more to go. Sixth, I think we need to integrate the social sciences more effectively. And politics, economics, and so forth. I would particularly like to see more attention applied to integrating history and, of course, the arts and so on. But I'll single out history alone because many of the issues that we address have got deep historical roots to them. And too often we apply ourselves in kind of the present, looking to the future, sometimes not even looking very far into the future, but without fully understanding how did these problems come about. I really think that without understanding how problems first came about, and often the long historical background to those problems, we end up creating solutions that either not well considered or sometimes entirely misappropriately considered. So I'd like to see people in business schools where history is almost never discussed, never explored. I would like to see history becoming much more of a stable building block in the creating of social innovators. An appreciation of history, an understanding of history, and an important role that is played. And finally, my seventh point, I'd like to see the cutting out of hero worshipping. I think we have to recognize that everyone in society has got a talent. We should embrace diversity. We all have, whatever our backgrounds, whatever our positions, we all have a right to contribute. No one is special in this arena, even if they think they are special in their own little minds. As John Maynard Keynes famously said, in the end, we're all dead. So those are my points that I wanted to float. I'd be, if you have some of your own points or you'd like to contribute in some way, I'd certainly be happy to hear. And if I've got anything to add, I said I will aim to do so. Thank you very much for your patience and your attention.
Just before anybody has any questions, I just wanted to say thank you very much for that, and that you have picked up on a few themes that have been going backwards and forwards over some of the other sessions as well. Yeah, I mean, first of all, has anybody got any questions, any thoughts, any comments on any of this?
I think it's hard to disagree with those points, but they're harder to implement, right? And I'm just wondering, in your work, like how easy have these ideas been to float with your clients and partners, and what are your own sort of first steps, I guess, in trying to do some of these things?
Well, I think when one is addressing, and some of the points that I've related to have been are on the macro field, such as politics or the way finances are allocated and so on. I think one of the things we've learned is that movements matter. Me Too movement, the Black Lives Matter movement, those who want to protect community involvement in football and so forth in the last day or two. So I think it is, I think if we can create some kind of a movement and some kind of a debate and say to people who are, for instance, who have access to the funds and providing the funds, is that criteria really important? What are the consequences of that? And I think that we should insist that there's a debate around criteria whenever yet another foundation puts out its money. I think we should have a democratic debate about how those funds are being applied and so forth. I'll give you an example. The Gates Foundation funded some years ago a whole set of mosquito nets, given as donations to Myanmar. And the way the rules were applied, and I hope perhaps a disclaimer in case I say anything inaccurate at this point and the Gates Foundation come down on me, but the way the rules were applied was that these mosquito nets, which, you know, we can all see the benefit of that, would require a certain chemical, which you could only get in the United States. So they could only come from the US and so on. But on the ground, people were making, in Myanmar, they were making mosquito nets. And suddenly their industry was wiped out by a funder. And often these were women who were making these mosquito nets. And one can almost chart a direct connection between the introduction of those mosquito nets, the wiping out of a sector of the Myanmar economy, the local economy, and the increase in sex working. So people have losing their job, desperate to survive. And here's an example that sometimes big funders, very respected, very sound in many areas, just blundering in without really understanding and without enough democratic discussion about the implications of what they're doing. So I think we need as social innovators to say, hang on, before we go any further, let's talk, we don't have to spend a lot of time on it because time itself is short, but we need to have a proper discussion on how these things are doing. And over time, I think the funders will respond and adjust. I think the political movement will adjust, and the other areas that I've tried to connect to. And technology, we are already seeing the big players, the big social media companies, they are starting to become sensitive to how consumers are reacting, but we need to hype that up far, far more and in a much more coordinated way.
Can I just add a quick sort of response to that as well? I mean, one of the things that, because I have sort of background studying economics, and one of the things that we do as part of that is development economics, which is absolutely fascinating. I mean, it's an incredible thing to look into, but some of the kind of the theory around it is just quite scary. And the example you're giving about mosquito nets, I've seen something else recently around the Gates Foundation, and it was a completely different thing that they were doing. I think it was to do with it might even be vaccines in somewhere or other. But the idea that basically that this isn't just a sort of blundering in, but a kind of a deliberate thing, you know, that's understood and kind of documented is actually quite a scary thing. So this idea that what you do is you basically make countries dependent on things so that they lose their natural capacity to create things for themselves, while at the same time creating kind of a kind of class of very wealthy people who are there to buy stuff from other countries it's quite amazing. So there's this whole thing called the Gini coefficient, which is about this distribution of income, where actually you can manipulate it in some way through your aid programs or through economic policy or through whatever investing. Then it benefits those countries that are trying to exploit the other countries. So I think there's something in all of this about a higher level kind of economic understanding of how things work as well, which I find is a really interesting thing for everybody everybody to try and explore. So I just think that whole point about how that industry, you can see what's happened with the mosquito nets, but this is going on all the time. So I think it's a really interesting topic in itself.
I'm glad you've raised that, Simon, because I think that the use of development aid and some of the big development organizations are having a catastrophic effect in too many countries. Too often aid is linked with exploitation, sometimes very directly in relation to sex and so forth. It can distort the economies. You go to the capital of Laos. Certainly I've forgotten the name of it, and you'll find the finest French restaurants that exist in one of the poorest countries. It's not to serve the locals; it's there to serve the aid workers and so forth. You go to Cuba, and the jobs are tied up in areas like, to deal with tourism, in a way a little bit linked to this kind of aid. People who are doctors and medical students and so on ending up working as waiters because that's where the money is, and that's what you have well often when you get the great distortions of this. Médecins Sans Frontières, they go in there, they do good work, but they don't work with the local medical teams. They come in, they do their stuff, and they leave, and they take their equipment out. And often by that stage, the local doctors and medical people have already had to go and get another job or do something elsewhere. So I think the development world and those big charities need to seriously look at the way in which they're applying themselves in localities. And we're starting to see some news and debate coming out of that, but I think I think there's a lot of big scandals there that have yet to be uncovered.
Mark had his hand up. I wondered if you still wanted to say something or ask a question.
Well, I mean that's so when we did the Ghetto conference back in 2000.
Sorry,
Mark,
I can't hear you very well, Mark. Can't hear you very well.
Can't hear it?
No.
No.
No, it's the connection. Is it your headphones or speakers or microphone, maybe?
It's both. It's not.
Can you write it in the chat? Right. Any other comments or questions? We'll wait for Mark to write his.
Well, perhaps back to is it Elsie? Is that if I pronounced your name correctly?
Elise. Yeah.
Elise, sorry, thank you, Elise. I'm dreadful at names. Elise, I think we may have an opportunity because of the whole pandemic to start re-looking at some of these old rules. So I think we have an opportunity now to reshape this environment. Indeed, I think it's the purpose of this entire conference season is spotting that opportunity to start to look at these ways that things are done and to say, we don't have to keep doing it the way they've been done before. So I think we may have a window of opportunity. Never let a crisis go to waste. And I think this could be that time. As Mark has said, we spoke about this at Greek Yoko, creation of Africa Gathering Conference. We spoke on the need to involve and embed within the countries that are affected. Yes, I think, and the people locally must be involved at all stages, at all stratas of society, not just the government, not just those that are well connected, but whenever you apply power and money, you're going to distort something, and sometimes that can be good, and sometimes it can be bad. And too often, it's the weakest people, the least connected, the least wealthy have much space to get their points across.
That kind of ties into something that I wanted to say, just in terms of that sort of power structure. And, you know, when we're talking about gates, and it's not necessarily that they have like bad intent or whatever, it's just that we've created these monolithic structures, if you, whatever, capitalism, whatever, that now have, you know, this way of working, and it's so hard for them to change. So that's one huge issue. And then because of that, we've now got this whole pool of like nimble, agile consultancies that work with them, who can maybe do that more human-centered work, speak to people on the ground. And that's kind of where I work. I work for a sort of public health consultancy that work with those kind of, you know, UNICEF, you know, whoever, to sort of make sure that the solutions are very centered on the people that it impacts, the stakeholders. And a lot of the work that we're doing now is really moving into like capacity building and kind of creating obsolescence in our work, and or whatever, self-sustaining impact. There's so many terms that we could be throwing around. But I just want to bring it back to that kind of movement idea that you sort of floated, because I think there's just like a lack of cohesion in terms of like the people that are doing that work. There's a lot of us floating around and trying to create change in these structures of power, whatever. I mean, the political impact is a huge piece, and one of the things that I thought was really interesting that you highlighted, because it may be jumping around a bit, but in terms of this opportunity now in this crisis and this pause and this breath, you know, some countries, say Denmark, they created a lot of what's the word, you know, they funded, say, airlines, whatever, but there were sort of precursors to make sure that afterwards they had to sort of change the way of working. So they created mechanisms to improve business going on after the pandemic. For some reason, I've forgotten all the terminology I'm trying to say there. But that was very few and far between. You know, that didn't happen enough. And it's something that Mariana Mazzucato talks a lot about in terms of, you know, it's not necessarily that investment in social innovation needs to change, but we need to kind of build in these, like a return. You know, if it's not money, what else are we getting? What is the social impact of this? And that's not really happening enough, or really at all in a lot of cases. So I think, to me, that's like the huge bridge to gap. And I think by and large, it's a huge, bigger issue in the West because of the way that our political landscape works. You know, China can wake up tomorrow and be like, we're going to plant 10 million trees, and they're going to do it. And, you know, I worry a bit about the sort of situation we're in the West, where we sort of have these monolithic institutions, quite a lack of ability to change, really. And I'll stop there because I've been talking for a long time.
Completely agree. Yeah, and I think New Zealand might be an interesting country to look at. They have gone beyond GDP in terms of the way in which they measure their national progress, and I know that the Treasury in New Zealand is developing a community model for communities to use based on that. I don't think it's been made public yet, or it's been released. Certainly I haven't seen it yet, but I think that's one to watch. And I think that what you started out at, you know, people are well-meaning. These big organizations, they are well-meaning. It's partly they just don't have the background and the experience and the diversity to, and they don't question themselves. They too often think they're brilliant, and they're not perhaps self-critical enough and self-reflective enough. And this is a chance when they should can become more so.
So yeah, we just have a couple of minutes left. I see some comments coming up in the chat. So I just had my hand up. Just one thing, that there's a word that came out yesterday that is a nice, interesting word. So the session we had yesterday from Adria from Barcelona, he was talking about the work that he does with housing and how that works and how connected that work is. And the word that he used when I was talking to him after was basically infrastructuring. And I really like this word for, in the sort of design realm, the idea that things like movements, the kind of things that you're talking about, require some kinds of infrastructure to be built. by designers, by the people involved in them. You know, how do we support movements to emerge? How do we support these things that happen? Because obviously, you know, you talked about technology and social media, all these things, you know, the infrastructure is there for those things. You know, how are we building the infrastructure for these other things that need to happen to actually kind of, you know, achieve these things that you're talking about? So I just thought the word infrastructuring was really nice. That's kind of come up in this conference as well.
Very much so. Yeah, I like that one. And you know, perhaps just to close, I am concerned, I am worried, I'm definitely dissatisfied, and I think many of us are. But I think we have an opportunity. You know, it's we may have lost a few battles, but the war certainly isn't finished, and I think we can. You know, but we have to move fast. We have to get beyond tinkering, and move in a much more coordinated, consistent, open manner, because time is running out. As Michel Barnier said on another matter, the clock is ticking.